The night was unnaturally quiet over Alcatraz Island when the guards discovered the impossible. 3 prisoners, Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, had vanished from their locked cells. In their beds lay clever dummy heads made of soap, toilet paper, and real human hair. To the guards, it looked like the men were still sleeping. But when one officer finally reached out to shake John Anglin, the head rolled off the pillow and shattered on the cold concrete floor. Panic ripped through the prison. The most escape-proof place in America had been beaten. But how? And more importantly, where were they now? No one knew at that moment that somewhere in the dark waters of San Francisco Bay, a homemade raft made of raincoats might have been drifting through the freezing waves. No one knew if the men were alive, or if the bay had swallowed them whole. All anyone knew was this: Alcatraz, the place built to be impossible to escape, had just been outsmarted. And the truth behind what happened next would shake America for decades. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary wasn't just a prison. It was a fortress. Sharp rocks, icy water, and deadly currents surrounded it like nature's own army. When new inmates arrived, the first thing they heard was the wind howling across the island. The second thing they heard was the metal gate slamming shut behind them, the sound that told them their old life was gone forever. Frank Morris heard that sound too. He stepped off the boat with calm eyes, looking more like a man studying a puzzle than someone facing the toughest prison in America. Frank was highly intelligent. Some said genius level. He had escaped from other prisons before, slipping out like a shadow. Alcatraz, the authorities believed, would be the one place he couldn't outrun. John and Clarence Anglin arrived not long after. They were brothers from Florida with a history of bank robberies, but everyone who knew them said they were inseparable, 2 minds that worked like one. The guards noticed how quiet they were, how they watched everything, especially the routines of the officers. Quiet didn't mean harmless. Quiet meant planning. Life on Alcatraz followed strict rules. Breakfast at dawn. Work hours in the shop. Silence in the cell block. For most inmates, the days blended together like a gray fog. But not for Frank. Every detail mattered to him. The cracks in the walls, the loose bolts in the vents, the shift changes, even the direction the wind blew at night. He watched. He calculated. And slowly, he began to see something the prison believed didn't exist: a weakness. It started with a tiny hole behind the air vent in Frank's cell. The cement around it was old, crumbling from years of sea moisture. Using spoons, stolen tools, and pure patience, Frank began scraping away at the wall, 1 grain of sand at a time. The Anglin brothers did the same in their cells, hiding the dust in their pants and dumping it in the yard during their daily walk. At low points, their fingers bled from scraping. Their tools broke. Some nights the guards walked too close, forcing them to freeze in total silence, heartbeats pounding so hard they thought the walls might hear them. But they pushed on, knowing that every inch they carved was 1 inch closer to freedom. Still, time was running out. Alcatraz wasn't a place where you could try and fail. One mistake meant isolation, beatings, or worse. So the men built decoys, fake heads molded from soap and covered with real hair taken from the prison barbershop. They painted them carefully, matching skin tones with homemade dyes made from floor polish. Everything had to look perfect. One wrong detail and a guard would notice. One wrong detail and the whole escape would crumble. The night before the escape, a storm rolled over the island. Waves crashed like thunder, and the wind shook the cell block windows. Any ordinary inmate would have been terrified of the bay that night. But for Frank and the Anglin brothers, it was the perfect cover. Hours before dawn, they crawled through the holes behind their vents and climbed to the roof of the cell block. Their hands trembled, not from fear, but from the cold metal pipes they used as ladders. Below them, the guards walked their normal rounds, never looking up. And then it happened, an extreme moment that pushed everything into chaos. As Clarence Anglin reached the top of the pipes, a loud crack echoed through the ceiling beam above him, and the entire escape nearly collapsed in an instant. For 1 terrifying second, Clarence froze. The cracking sound shot through the dark like a gunshot, and all 3 men held their breath. If the beam snapped, it would send Clarence crashing down onto the concrete floor below, right into the path of the guards. The smallest thud could ruin everything. Frank tightened his grip on the pipe, whispering sharply for Clarence to stop moving. The beam above them creaked again, like an old door complaining under heavy weight. But somehow, by luck or by fate, it held steady. Clarence pulled himself up slowly, careful not to breathe too hard. When he reached the top, the three men lay still, listening for any sign that the guards had heard. Nothing. Only the wind hammering the rooftop. They had survived one disaster, but the night was far from over. The rooftop felt like stepping into another world. The air was colder, the rain stronger, and the sound of the bay roared louder than anything inside the prison walls. Below them, Alcatraz looked smaller than it had ever looked. Tiny windows glowing from the cell block they had just escaped. Frank led the way, crawling low, staying hidden from the guard towers. Searchlights swept across the yard, cutting through the darkness like giant white blades. If even one of those beams hit them, everything would be over. The plan was simple on paper. Reach the far end of the roof, climb down a drainage pipe, cross the yard, avoid the guards, and reach the shoreline where they had hidden their homemade raft. But nothing about the path felt simple now. The rain beat down so hard it blurred their vision. The roof tiles were slick like ice. One slip could send any of them tumbling over the edge. Frank signaled with his hand. Stop. A guard tower light paused, hanging over the yard as if the guard sensed something. The three men pressed their bodies flat, the cold water soaking through their clothes. Frank could hear Clarence's breath trembling beside him. For nearly a full minute, the light hovered. Then, finally, it drifted away. They moved again, inch by inch, their bodies cold and shaking, until they reached the drainage pipe. Climbing down felt even harder than climbing up. The metal pipe was wet, and their hands were stiff from the cold. Clarence went first, sliding slowly. John followed. Frank came last, gripping the pipe with every bit of strength he had left. When he finally touched the ground, it felt unreal, like the island itself had allowed them to move forward. But the most dangerous part was still ahead, the yard. The yard was wide open, with nowhere to hide except behind a few low walls. The searchlights kept sweeping, and the guards on patrol were only minutes apart. Timing was everything. Frank waited until the wind howled loud enough to cover their footsteps. Then they ran. Not fast, not slow, just steady enough to cross the open space without drawing attention. Halfway across, Frank spotted something that made his stomach sink. A guard was stepping out of the main building sooner than expected. The schedule had changed. The man's flashlight cut through the yard, passing dangerously close. The three escapees dropped to the ground, pressing themselves against the wet concrete. The flashlight beam slid across the yard, stopping just inches from John's right hand. Frank didn't breathe. John didn't breathe. Even the wind seemed to hold still. Finally, the guard turned away. They moved again, legs trembling. When they reached the shoreline, their raft lay exactly where they had left it, hidden behind rocks, tied down with strips of cloth. It was made of 50 raincoats stitched and glued together with homemade paste. It looked fragile, like it might fall apart from a single wave. But it was their only hope. Frank touched the raft with shaking fingers. They had practiced folding it, sealing it, and inflating it. Now they had to trust it with their lives. They worked quickly, hands numb from the cold. The wind slapped the water hard, and waves rolled onto the shore. The bay looked wild, angry, ready to swallow anyone who dared enter it. Just as they finished preparing the raft, a new danger struck, an extreme moment that brought everything crashing down again. From somewhere behind them, a guard's voice echoed across the yard. "Who's out there?" A flashlight beam snapped toward the shoreline, swinging closer and closer to where the three men crouched in the shadows. The flashlight beam swept closer, slicing through the darkness like a glowing blade. Frank, John, and Clarence crouched low, their bodies pressed against the rocks, barely daring to breathe. The guard's footsteps crunched over gravel as he moved toward the shoreline. One wrong movement, one whisper, one slip of a shoe, and the entire escape, the months of planning, scraping, building, would end right here. Frank whispered sharply, "Don't move." The light paused directly above them, so close Frank could see dust floating inside the beam. For a moment, it felt like the world stopped. Then, somewhere behind the guard, another officer called out. The flashlight jerked away, and the guard turned his head. "Yeah? I'm coming," he shouted back. His footsteps faded. The three men didn't wait. This was their one chance. Their final chance. Frank grabbed the raft. John took the air pump. Clarence shoved their few supplies into a coat tied like a sack. Every second counted now. The wind howled and the waves slammed against the rocks, but the danger behind them was even worse. They dragged the raft toward the water, slipping on the wet stones. The cold spray hit their faces, sharp as needles. Frank muttered, "We go now." With trembling hands, he inflated the raft. It rose slowly, its rubbery surface shining under the faint moonlight. John checked the seams to make sure it wouldn't split in the rough waters. Clarence wrapped his arms around himself, shivering hard. The bay looked like a monster waiting to grab them. But they didn't come this far to turn back. The water was freezing the moment it touched their feet. Frank gritted his teeth as the icy cold shot up his legs. They pushed the raft farther, letting the waves lift it. John climbed in first, then Clarence, then Frank. The raft rocked violently under their weight, almost flipping. The men grabbed the sides, steadying it. The wind whipped their faces, and every wave felt like it might tear the raft apart. But behind them was Alcatraz, walls, bars, guards, and a life they refused to keep living. Ahead of them was darkness, danger, and maybe freedom. They began to paddle using pieces of wood, fighting against the currents that pushed them back toward the island. At times the raft felt like it wasn't moving at all, as if the bay wanted to keep them trapped. Frank shouted over the wind, "Keep going, no matter what." The cold made their muscles ache, but the fear of being caught was stronger. They paddled, and paddled, and paddled. The lights of Alcatraz grew smaller behind them. The city lights of San Francisco sparkled faintly ahead, like tiny stars promising hope. Halfway through the journey, a massive wave slammed into the raft. Water poured over the sides, freezing their hands numb. Clarence slipped, nearly falling into the water. John grabbed him by the shirt, pulling him back in. The raft bounced wildly, twisting like a cork in the waves. Frank yelled, "Hold on." Another wave crashed, nearly flipping them. The raft groaned under the force it seemed stretching. For a terrible moment, Frank thought it would rip open. But somehow it held. Then the fog rolled in. Thick, heavy, blinding fog. They could no longer see the city. They could barely see each other. The waves kept slamming them from every direction, and the wind howled like a living thing. The men kept paddling anyway, each stroke slower than the last. Their arms felt like lead, their hands frozen. Frank's voice grew weaker. "Keep going, keep going." The fog swallowed their voices. Hours passed, maybe, or minutes, or seconds. In the fog, time didn't feel real. Then came the moment no one would ever truly explain. A massive wave struck the raft, larger than the others, rising above them like a dark wall. Frank shouted something. No one could hear him. The raft lurched violently to the side. John lost his grip. Clarence tried to hold him. The raft spun. The water roared louder than thunder. And then crash. The wave hit. The raft flipped. The men disappeared into the black, freezing bay, swallowed by the fog and the crashing waves. When the sun rose the next morning, the raft was gone. The men were gone. Only pieces of raincoat material washed ashore, along with a paddle. The FBI searched the bay for days. They found nothing else. But years later, strange clues began to appear, photos, letters, and whispers suggesting that at least one of them might have survived. That the greatest escape in American history might truly have worked. And so the story of Alcatraz's impossible escape lives on, leaving one final question hanging over the United States to this very day. Did they make it?